within 10 years, we doubled the size of the workforce. We went from being, as I said, an emigrant society to being an immigrant society. Massive changes happening in a very, very telescoped way. And there's no doubt about the fact that the rapidity of that change makes it sort of hard to conceptualize. It's actually quite tough to figure out in your own head what's going on. There's some seats up the front, by the way, if people want to hear more about it. It's not like a church. But the other thing I think that happened is not just about the rapidity of the change, but it's about the way in which the change was conceptualized. And I think that conceptualization became fatal. And we don't really have time. I'm not going to go into and bore you about, what was the Celtic Tiger, how did it happen. But I think one thing we can sort of agree on is that it was a very complex phenomenon. We can agree on this because historical phenomena are always very complex. It's almost a tautology. Large numbers of factors have to come together at the same time in order to create the kind of rapid and profound change that you got in Ireland. And let's just say a couple of those factors. One of them, for example, was something that was completely outside of our control. It was just pure dumb luck, right? Which was the 1990s was the period of the greatest expansion in world trade in history. Much of that expansion was fueled from an incredibly rapidly expansionist American economy, partly fueled by the IT boom. So there was a vast amount of new trade, new business, new investment. And that was nothing to do with us, that was pure luck. The bit that was to do with us was that we were well positioned to be able to take advantage of a lot of that investment. We were well positioned because we had invested in education. We were well positioned because we had a young workforce demographically, which again was not kind of deliberate, but our demographics were actually very, very favourable. The demographics is kind of worth dwelling on because, mainstream economists tend to talk about very, very narrow things, and they forget actually that sometimes one of the big economic factors is people and the structure of your population. There was two things happened to us. One is that we had our baby boom much later than the rest of the Western world. So the 1950s baby boom that happened, the post-war baby boom, didn't really happen in Ireland. In the 1950s, it happened in the 1960s, 1970s. So, consequentially, you had a lot of young people joining the potential workforce in the 1990s because of that. You also had, kind of grotesquely in a way, something we don't like to talk about, but a lot of our older people who would have had to pay the medical costs, the pensions, all the rest of it, a lot of which what should have been our older people in the 1990s were actually in England because of mass emigration in the 1950s. But you also had a huge kind of change that was happening because of feminism. Feminism was one of the big drivers of this kind of change in Ireland because part of the reason why the Irish workforce expanded so dramatically was that married women stayed in the workforce or rejoined the workforce. That didn't happen without huge changes in the religious culture, in gender relations, and all the kind of stuff that happened as a result of the feminist movement in the early 1970s. So you have all these kind of factors feeding in. Essentially, just to sum that up, what they call the dependency ratio, which is the proportion between the number of people at work and the number of people who are not at work, completely reversed itself over the course of the 1990s. So at the beginning of the 1990s, you had roughly about 2.2 dependents for every worker. By the early 21st century, you had roughly 2.2 workers for every dependent. And that's a huge economic boom. That's actually creates the conditions for rapid economic growth because you have an awful lot of people working, a lot of people paying taxes, and you have relatively fewer people who are either very young or very old who are dependent. And of course, that's also somewhat self-sustaining. So the more people you have at work, the fewer people you have are dependent on social welfare, and it's kind of a virtuous circle that sort of started off. So you had a very complex phenomenon, and it was fed into by things that like social partnership, for example, which were fairly distinctively Irish, problematic process, had all sorts of weaknesses and limitations, but actually was incredibly important in terms of providing the kind of stability, the kind of consensus, and whatever degree of forward planning we got in the society, which was purely pathetic, but a lot of it we got out of social partnership because you have to sit down every 5 years and say, what are we going to do over the next 5 years, roughly speaking. So you have a whole range of things that kind of fed into this complex phenomenon. The problem was that we stopped thinking of it as a complex phenomenon. And part of what happened was that Ireland suddenly made an awful lot of sense to a certain kind of political ideology. And that political ideology was sort of essentially American neoliberalism. The sort of neoliberal orthodoxy picked on Ireland as the poster child. It was the proof that neoliberalism, neoliberal globalization works. It's a formula. And it's a formula which consists of adopting absolutely business-friendly policies, having very light regulation, and cutting taxes. And if you do these things, Ireland seems to suggest, then you will succeed. Now, there's no doubt about the fact that regulation, business-friendly policies, taxation played a part in the creation of the Celtic Tiger. But they only played, I would suggest, a very qualified part and a very temporary part in the creation of this complex phenomenon. Now, the problem was that we suddenly were faced in Ireland with this kind of bizarre, unprecedented situation for us. We were used to being held up as the basket case, and now we were being held up as the best boys in the class. And the problem was we started to believe our own propaganda. I also think this is the real problem with the Irish political class. It's not that they were spinning or that they were coming out with kind of simplistic mantras, because that's often what political classes do. The problem was that they actually believed it. And that belief fostered a kind of fatal self-delusion, I would suggest, over time. So we began to think that the Celtic Tiger, and even the invention of that phrase, wasn't a complex historical phenomenon in a specific country, which was about what happened here and about the social processes that were at work here and about the management of our own society. We began to think actually it was a model. The Irish model started to be talked about. And we started not simply to export goods and services, we started to export the Irish model. This idea that the Irish have found the lamp, they rub the lamp, the genie comes out, and anybody, if you just get the lamp and you rub it, the genie's going to happen, you get this kind of development. And this ends up with the farcical spectacle of Bertie Ahern giving very expensive lectures in Honduras, in 2008 while the Irish economy is collapsing, telling everybody, just follow the Irish model and you will be fine. A lot of people made a lot of money out of going around the world telling people about the Irish model. And the problem with it was that we then, in terms of political strategy, in terms of the way in which we envisaged what was happening to us, we sort of bought into this notion that it was a model, that it was the neoliberal global model that had delivered all this wonder to us, and that we simply had to keep repeating this formula. So, particularly in terms of taxation, keep cutting taxes, and in terms of regulation, that we pride ourselves on having a low regulation economy, in particular, of course, a low regulation financial services system, and that these things are the crucial elements of sustaining prosperity. Whereas, in fact, they were the crucial elements to the inability to sustain that prosperity. So this kind of conceptual problem, I think, is something we have to be aware of. And then we have to also look at the second part of the question, which is what didn't change. And what didn't change, I would suggest, were 5 things, basically. The first of these was our political culture. We had this incredible ability in Ireland to adapt to everything with change. So I remember Oscar Wilde said we can resist everything except temptation. It's like we can continually adapt in order to maintain a conservative core of stuff that doesn't change at all. And we did this while immigration was very often. In order to keep hold of the 10-acre farm in Mayo for one son,